haven't yet found the book of Jonah, there's still time to do so. Let me just say this, okay, just to relieve some pressure. There's no shame in the game of looking at the table of contents, okay? And so some of you are like, you just given up. At this point, you're like, I've been looking, I don't know where it is. Like, that's why the Bible gives us a table of contents. So you can turn there. I got a long introduction just to give you more space to find the book of Jonah. I'll also say this, if you're here with us and you're new, maybe you're new to the faith and you say, I don't have a Bible. We actually have copies of Scripture for you on your way in. There's some Bibles by the door there, and so those are a gift from us to you, so you can take one on your way out, and that's yours to have and to use. All right, so yes, we are starting a new series in the book of Jonah. We'll be in the book just for 3 weeks, just a short series to look at God's heart for all peoples. One of my favorite quotes of all time by the pastor John Piper, he says this: missions exist because worship doesn't. Missions exist because worship doesn't. I want us to think about this for a second, okay? What that means is that the primary goal for the follower of Jesus is not missions, it's worship. Think about that. The primary goal for the follower of Jesus is not missions, it is worship. So what that means is, it means that missions is the means by which the Christian helps people from all tribes, tongues, languages, and people to encounter God and follow His way. That's why missions exist. That's not the end in and of itself. The end is worshiping Jesus. And so missions is the vehicle by which we see that happen. This is what we see in the book of Revelation. We see all the way in the end of time. In Revelation chapter 7, we have this picture of what heaven will be like. And the result of missions will be all peoples from all tribes, tongues, nations, and languages worshiping Jesus. And so this is what it says in Revelation 7, verses 9 and 10. It says, "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every tribe, nation, from all of the peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice." This is what they're doing. They're worshiping. They're saying, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb of God." That's the result of missions. It leads to worship. Now, I know when we say the word missions, what we got to be careful of is we can use these words kind of in church, and we kind of know what they mean, but we're not 100% sure what they mean, and so we just kind of use them in hopes that we're using them in the right way. When we moved into one of our old houses back in North Carolina, there was a tool that was sitting on the workbench. The previous owners had left it there, and so I looked at this tool. I had no clue what it did, okay? This is what the tool was. Now, I know that some of you in here, you're smarter than me, and so you know what that is, okay? You get a reward. Good for you, okay? I know some of you are like, why didn't you Google what it was? Okay, so sue me. I didn't Google, all right? I had this tool sitting in my garage. I had no clue what it was. Every once in a while, I would pick it up, and I would use it to, like, hammer things because it's pretty heavy. And I was like, I don't have my hammer. And I was like, oh, I have this random tool here, and I would just use it to smack stuff, or had a little lip there, so every once in a while I would use it to kind of pry stuff off. Well, one day I had a good friend of mine over, and he's a firefighter, and he says, why do you have a hydrant wrench? And I was like, that's what it is. It's a hydrant wrench. It literally is built or meant to open a fire hydrant, okay? That helps. Now I know what the tool is for, and I can use it for that purpose, even though now I know I have no use for it, you know? I think sometimes we can kind of do that with certain things in the church, you know, like words like missions. We're like, I kind of know what it means, and I'm not 100% sure, and I'm kind of using it. So what I want to do in this series is I want to be able to unpack what is it that we mean when we talk about missions. And I want to use this series to help us as a church further understand what the Bible is saying to us when it talks about God's mission, both locally here in our city and globally all around the world. And so what we're going to do is we're going to dive into this book of Jonah, and we're going to strategically think about practical ways. Like, we're going to get very street level. What are practical ways that we can engage the mission of God right now, where you live, work, eat, and play? And so that's what we're going to do over the next 3 weeks. The book of Jonah is a fairly simple book. The book of Jonah really is about two things. It is about a man who is running from God, and it is about a God who pursues Jonah. So really, it's about sin and grace. It's about a guy who's rebelling against God and a God who in the midst of this man's rebellion pursues him. But it is also, we see, it is a book that shows us God's heart for all peoples. For all peoples. And so our big idea for today, for Jonah chapter 1, really is a big idea for the entire series, is this, that the gospel saves us, but it also sends us out. Not only does the gospel save us, but it sends us back out with that same good news on our lips to all peoples. And so hopefully that introduction now gave you enough time to find the book of Jonah, okay? If not, I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you, all right? And so as we begin to dive into chapter 1, what I want us to think about, do a little thought experiment. I want you to think about a time in your life where you made some sort of bad plan, okay? Now, I know not all bad plans are created equal. Some are a bit more consequential than others, but I guarantee you every single one of us in here has made some type of bad plan at some point in our life. When I was 12 years old, 2 days before school started back up again, me and my best friends, we had a sleepover, Rob and Dan, and we decided that we were going to, on the last day of summer break, we were going to build a half pipe in my parents' backyard. We thought that was the best way to spend the last day of summer break. Now, here's the problem. We had no materials. We had no money. We had no plans. We really had nothing. All we had was a little bit of willpower and preteen ignorance. Like, that's what we had going for us. And so we set out the next day to build this half pipe. Our plans came to a crashing halt when I used my dad's miter saw and I cut right through a nail and it broke his blade. And he was like, "That's it, boys. Your idea's over." Okay, like it was a bad plan from the start and it finished just the way it started. It was just a terrible idea. All of us at some point in our life have made some type of bad plan, and that's what's greeting us here in Jonah chapter 1. That Jonah receives a command from God and he makes a very bad plan. And so what I want to do today is I just want to kind of look at really two things. I want to look at the command that God gave Jonah, but then I want to look more specifically at the resistance that Jonah gave, the rebellion that we see in Jonah's life. And what I want to do is I want to use that as an extension to help us to see the proclivity that all of us have in our life to resist the commands of God. But then we're going to see how even in the midst of our rebellion and resistance, God pursues us. Even when we're fleeing from him, God comes after us. Now, two disclaimers before we jump into the first point. As we're getting into the book of Jonah, what I want to say at the outset is I'm not sure why some of these Bible stories are the ones that we make into like the cute little children's storybooks, okay? Like you think about the book of Jonah, you're like, man, the book of Jonah is about an idolatrous, racist guy and the wrath of God sending a storm. You know, you're like, I don't know, that doesn't seem like a real good children's story. You know, or I always love Daniel in the Lion's Den. I'm like, here we go. Like, we're teaching our kids Daniel in the Lion's Den. Like, here's these cute little lions. I'm like, no, these lions have been starved. And here is this pagan king who's feeding this guy who's done nothing wrong into this den of lions to, like, rip him to shreds. I'm like, that's not going to get my kids to sleep at night. You know what I mean? Nonetheless, like, these are our children's stories. Now, here's the danger with that, okay? That's funny, but the danger with that oftentimes is what ends up happening is we see these stories in the Bible more like children's fables and not real events in human history. And the problem with that is, as we come to the Bible and we open it up, the problem with that, particularly as it relates to Jonah, is that's just not how Jesus saw this story. And so right off the bat, I just want to get us to see what Jesus says in Matthew 12, verse 40. He says this, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." So Jesus, first and foremost, just the disclaimer, Jesus affirms the historicity of what's happening here in the book of Jonah. The other disclaimer I want to say is that we do not need some news story about how some lobster fisherman off the coast of Maine was swallowed and he was survived in the belly of some fish. We do not need that in order to confirm what happened here. Back in 2021, there was a guy, Michael Packard. He was a lobster fisherman, not the normal lobster fisherman. He apparently dove, and he would dive down to the bottom of the ocean, and he would get lobsters and bring them back up to the surface. And so off the coast of Cape Cod is where he was doing his lobster fishing. And he dives down. As he's coming back up, he feels this massive wave kind of engulf him. And he opens his eyes, and it's pitch black. And it takes him about 10 seconds. But then all of a sudden, he realizes he's inside the mouth of a whale. Now, thankfully, apparently, Michael Packard didn't taste very good. And about 30 seconds later, that whale spit him out. But I always get a kick out of this because I'm always like, man, people see that stuff and they're like, look, see? Like that proves that the story of Jonah is true. And look, you and I do not need Michael Packard to prove to us that Jonah was inside the belly of the fish. Here's why. The whole point of this story and what happened with Jonah, the whole point is to show us that it's impossible. But here's the thing. God is in the business of messing around with the impossible. And so what we see in the story is if God created the entire universe out of nothing, and if God raised Jesus from the dead, then I think a few nights in a fish Airbnb, like I'm pretty sure he's got that covered. Like I'm pretty sure he's good. And so God doesn't need our scientific explanations or our news stories. I'm not saying that those aren't helpful, but God does not need our scientific explanations or our news stories to back him up, okay? He's doing fine without it. So let me get off my soapbox. All right. Now, verse 1. Here we go. Verse 1 of chapter 1. Now, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. The first thing I want us to see is that God commands. So Jonah receives a command from God. Now, one of the things that we have to realize here is that this was not Jonah's first rodeo. Okay, if you go to 2 Kings chapter 14, you realize that Jonah was a prophet in Israel. He prophesied under King Jeroboam II. And so Jonah, he was familiar with receiving commands from the Lord, with receiving words from the Lord. This would not have been something new for him. There's two things I want us to see as it relates to God's commands here. First, I want us to see that it is not complicated. That God's commands, oftentimes, they're not complicated. However, the second thing I want us to see, as we drill down a little bit more here, is that they're often not easy. So it's not complicated, but it's also, that doesn't mean that it's easy. Let's deal with the first of those. It's not complicated. Now, I hold in my hands here an iPhone, but just so you Gen Zers and Gen Alphas know, this was not always the way that we communicated with one another. There was this thing in my parents' kitchen called a landline. And the landline, just imagine this iPhone like mounted on a wall, okay, with about a 50-foot cord dangling from it, all right? You couldn't take it off, and oftentimes what you had to do in order to dial is you had to actually move the numbers all the way around on the rotary, which meant if you had a friend who had a 9 in his number, you're just like, no, I'm not worried about it. Like, I'm not going through the work of dialing that. So you had this landline on the wall, which meant you're sitting around the supper table and someone calls you. You didn't know who it was. It was a really risky business answering the phone back then, you know? Like nowadays, you can pick it up and you know, listen, you know that if someone doesn't pick up your call, let me just be honest with you, you know that they saw your name and they just made a choice, a conscious choice not to pick it up. But back in the day, I didn't know that. So you could call me and I didn't know it was you, and so everyone did one of these at the supper table, like not it, you know, like when I'm not answering it, you know. But then to make matters worse, it was even more complicated because there was this thing called collect calls. And so when I was in high school, when I would need a ride home from sports practice, what I would do is I would call collect. And what it would do is it would send you to an operator, okay? And the operator would ask for the number, but then they would say, who is calling? And you would say your name. And so on the other line, when the person received the call, they say you were receiving a collect call from Jeremy Dager. And then they would be asked if they want to receive the charges, okay? And so what we did was we found a workaround, okay? So what I did was when I called my parents for a ride home, instead of saying my name, I would say, I need a ride home from school. Right? So it would say, hey, you're receiving a collect call from, I need a ride home from school. All of that just to get a ride home from school. All you need to do now is pick up your phone. You literally tell a robot that lives in your phone, you say, hey, can you call so-and-so? And the next thing you know, your ride is there. All right? So communication, it was very complicated. I look at that, oftentimes, that's how complicated we often make or we think that hearing from God is. We make it into this massively complicated process where God has made it, specifically for what he's saying to Jonah here, God has made it very easy. Here's what Jesus says. As Jesus is about to ascend into heaven, and he's leaving his disciples, this is the message that Jesus gives to his disciples. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe what I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. This is what the Bible calls the Great Commission. And if you'll notice, it sounds a lot like the words that God commanded Jonah. It starts out with the word go. And so what that means is that followers of Jesus, we are called to go where God has called us to go and to do what God has called us to do. The command isn't complicated. God has made it very clear to us. When Pastor Chad mentioned that we're selling a book at our resource table, at the Connect table. It is a book by Shauna Pilgreen. She was a church planter with her husband in San Francisco. It is one of those books that if you look at it in our library at home, it is so full of bookmarks and pencil marks. It is by far one of the most practical books that I have ever read in terms of what does it mean to live out this mission in where God has placed us. And so we wanted to make that resource available to you guys. I would highly encourage you, either bring 10 pounds of food or go out and buy that book at our Connect table. It is immensely helpful. We're going to be referencing it throughout this series. But here's one of the things that Pilgreen says in her book. She says, like all Christ followers, we are sent places to show Jesus. Sure, his words are a mission trip verse, but so much more encompassing. They are also a lifestyle that includes how we parent, how we love, how we lead, how we shop, how we dine, how we explore, and how we serve. And if we don't show Jesus as we do these things, we fail the people in our cities, in our towns, and we abandon our sending God. And then she says this, look what she says. Choosing to live sent is moving towards something, not away from something. And it leads to an attachment to your community. Living sent is the strategy of loving people well in your town whom you are sent to. Love and watching God connect the dots. Living sent is for those who are called to stay in their childhood places and for those who must cross oceans. Living sent is for those who want to move and for those who have to move. For those who want to stay and for those who have to stay. To live sent is to be tied first and foremost to the Trinity of the God-created heart, mind, and soul. Living sent is an awakening to God's activity as we learn a culture and graciously give the truth of Christ. So the command is clear. God says to Jonah, arise. And what that command literally means is do not haste. Go quickly. And so the command isn't complicated, but we also have to understand that it's also not easy. It's not easy. And listen, as followers of Jesus, here's the truth. God rarely calls us to the comfortable. We might desire the comfortable, we might pray for the comfortable, but that is rarely where God or what God calls us to. And oftentimes, more often, God calls us to do the thing that is not easy. This was the command for Jonah. It was not easy. It says here that the Ninevites were a powerful nation. In fact, they were probably the most powerful nation that existed at that time. They were the capital. Nineveh, the city, was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And it was near what is today modern day or northern Iraq. And one of the things you learn about the city of Nineveh and the Assyrian Empire is it was one of the most wicked cities on the planet. They did a lot of fish slapping, okay? That's a VeggieTales reference, okay? If you've never seen VeggieTales, you don't get that. But in all seriousness, if you go and do some research on Nineveh, you will understand very quickly when you see the heinous practices that they deployed amongst their enemies and even on their own people. One of the things that you'll realize very quickly is why Jonah would not want God's grace to extend to them. It was a very wicked city. And so Jonah, he doesn't want to take the gospel there. Well, God is calling Jonah to here. It clearly falls outside of Jonah's comfort zone. Last week we celebrated D-Day, the time where the Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. And as a result of that battle that was fought there, we know that kind of ultimately led to the end of World War II. And I've been reading Stephen Ambrose's book recently on D-Day. It fascinates me, just that whole battle. And one of the things that fascinates me is you think about the troops that landed on the beach of Normandy. And one of the reasons why it was such a monumental battle is because most often in battle, you do not fight by landing on the seashore. That's not a very great tactic. And so, because what that meant was that those soldiers who were riding in what they call the LCPs, these little boats, that meant that first wave of soldiers that landed on the beach, when that door dropped down, it was pretty inevitable that they were going to get shot at. It was pretty inevitable they were going to get shot down. Because you had a German army that was standing on the beaches of Normandy that was just waiting with machine guns to mow them down. And I began to think about this, and this is what Ambrose draws out in his book. I just began to think about the day before, and they talk a lot about the speeches that were given by the officers that were in charge. And they talked about how the officers were very clear. And they said, look, guys, this is our mission. We're going to go storm these beaches tomorrow, and you guys in particular, you're on the front lines. And the reality is 9 out of 10 of you will probably suffer some type of casualty, if not death. And I thought about that, and I thought, how is it that you can be sitting there as a soldier listening to that command, which is very clear, knowing that it is probably going to cost you your life? How is it that you follow through on that? And one of the things that they point out, that Ambrose draws out in his book, is the reason that these soldiers did so is because, in essence, in some ways, what they did is they took refuge and security in their general. The reason that they followed through on the orders that they were given is not because they thought that they were invincible. It's because they trusted the person that was giving them the orders. What seemed impossible to them, they gave trust over because they believed in the one giving them the instruction. Think about that as it relates to us as followers of Jesus. Think about what we just read in the Great Commission. Jesus gives his disciples the Great Commission and then ascends to heaven. Every single one of those disciples, except for one, would die a martyr's death. Would die heinous, awful death. And so Jesus' command is very clear, but what he was giving them was not an easy command. How is it that the disciples were able to follow through on a command? Where did they get the willpower to go through with what was not an easy task at all? The reason that they had the willpower to do that is not in necessarily the command itself. It's in the promise that Jesus gives at the end of the command. Did you catch that? Here's what Jesus says at the end of the command, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. What that means is that the focus is never just on the command. The focus is always on the God who gives us the command. So what that means for us as followers of Jesus is the command to go. It might not be easy, but it is always possible with the presence of God. That's what we are guaranteed. We are not guaranteed that the mission will be easy, but we are guaranteed that God's presence will go with us in the midst of that mission. And what this does for us is it creates freedom. You think about that. You can go and do what God has called you to do. You can live missionally. You can live sent because you don't have to fret about the results. The results aren't up to you. You don't have to be afraid of how that person is going to respond. You don't have to be afraid of, or you don't have to force your response. You don't have to force anything or fret anything because you're going in obedience and the results are totally up to God. He's present with you. It's all up to him. Our task is to go. So that's the command that God gives Jonah. Let's see Jonah's response. Verse 3, but Jonah, he rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and he went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare, and he went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. So we see that God commands. The second thing we see is that Jonah resists. Jonah resists. We just need to be honest with ourselves about something here this morning. It is in our nature, it is in our sin nature to flee from God. And some of you know in your life, you have lived life in rebellion to God. And by God's grace, he has brought you back. The truth is that there are some of you in here this morning that you are currently living in rebellion to God. And that's why Jonah is such a relatable character. The reason that Jonah is so relatable is because in some ways we can all see ourselves through Jonah. Our own propensity for rebellion and resistance to God. And the truth here is that Jonah is not simply just trying to run from the commands of God. It says that Jonah is actually trying to flee from the presence of God himself. That word there in Hebrew, it's actually an idiom. When it says that Jonah ran away, it's literally an idiom in Hebrew that means that he is rebelling. Jonah is rebelling. It indicates an unwillingness to go and to do what God has called him to do. It's like if you ever watched a toddler and you tell a toddler to do something that they don't want to do, they don't just stand there. They go in the opposite direction. You know? That's exactly what Jonah is doing here. God is telling Jonah to do something, and he literally is fleeing in the complete opposite direction. He goes down to Joppa, and he finds a ship that is going to Tarshish. That's literally 4,000 kilometers in the opposite direction of Nineveh. That would be like me telling you to go to Miami and you end up going to the North Pole. Both of those are about 4,000 kilometers. Look, if I tell you to go to Miami and you go to the North Pole, you got problems, okay? But that just gives us a visual, right? Here we are in Halifax, Nova Scotia. You go to Miami, you literally are on a ship going, headed due north to the North Pole. That's what Jonah is doing here. Jonah is showing us something that I think is very helpful for us to see. That is that if you want to run from God, there will always be a ship in your life to take you. You think about if you're going on a diet. Have you ever been on a diet? The thing with a diet is the week that you decide to go on a diet is the week that like everything at the superstore that you love goes on sale. It's like, man, why are Doritos normally $18? And then like now they're like, 2 for $4, the week that you go on a diet. Or you go to Costco and you're like, man, the samples are in abundance today. Like, you ever see how that works? Like the second you go on a diet, there's always a ship to take you off that diet. You think about that as it relates to God's command in our life. You think about what God has commanded us in terms of stewarding our money. God calls us to give our money. There will always be a new expense or an unexpected bill that comes up. You think about God calling you to restore your marriage or to fight for your marriage. There will always be a person in your office at that time who shows you extra attention and treats you just the way that you wish your spouse would treat you. When God calls you to reconcile and to forgive a family member, there will always be a ship to take you away from forgiveness. Or when God calls you to share the gospel with a friend, guess what? There will always be an opportunity to walk out of that conversation. If you want to rebel against God, there will always be a ship to take you in that direction. And so this morning, let me just ask you bluntly, are you headed in the opposite direction of where God has commanded you? Have you boarded a ship to Tarshish? Are we in rebellion to God? The truth is, if you don't understand your heart, if you don't understand your propensity to resist God, and if you don't understand God's heart and who He is, the truth is that you will always think that it is easier to disobey than to obey God. Certainly that was Jonah's mindset. He thought it was a lot easier to jump on a ship and head in the opposite direction. That's why Jonah finds himself running. That's why he finds himself resisting the commands of God. But notice, though, what Jonah's resistance was. See, I think contrary to what a lot of times we think about when we think about the story of Jonah, we think, well, Jonah was afraid. The Ninevites were bad people, and so he was afraid to go. He feared for his life. We actually get to chapter 4, right? Not to skip ahead and ruin it, but you see in chapter 4 that no, it actually wasn't because Jonah was afraid of the Ninevites. Here's what Jonah says in chapter 4, verse 2. It says, and he prayed to the Lord, and he said, "O Lord, is this not what I said when I was yet in my country? That this is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster." What Jonah meant there was he fears the Lord. He just didn't want the Ninevites to get saved. And what you realize is that Jonah's resistance, it was not a lack of compassion. It was just that he didn't have a heart for all peoples. His heart was not God's heart. God's heart is very clear. In the book of Genesis, chapter 17, verse 5, this is what God says to Abram right before he changes his name into Abraham. He says, "No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I will make you a father of a multitude of nations." God's good news has always been for all peoples. And he says this in Isaiah 57:6, "Even those I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. The burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be acceptable on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples." And so Jonah has been given the command to go to the Ninevites, all peoples. Jonah resists because he doesn't want to extend the same grace that has been extended to him. He doesn't want to see that grace extended to other people. And so for Jonah, he has experienced the grace of God, but he fails to want to express that, to take that grace and to share it with other people. It's true. We never do anything like, we never do this in our life with anything else. Whenever we have experienced something that is life-changing, whether it's minor or major, whenever we experience something life-changing in our life, what do? We tell other people about it. Like, you better believe that I'm telling you about that burrito place that just opened up in Tantalon. Like, that place is amazing. Like, I spent so many days back in North Carolina eating Chipotle and Moe's and coming here and just longing for and praying for a good burrito place. And then we moved to Hammond's Plains and a burrito place opened, right? Jehovah Jireh. He does provide. But you better believe, I'm telling everybody, I'm like, man, have you guys been to this new bar burrito place over there in town? If something has changed my life, I'm going to tell other people about it. There's no way around it. Jonah's resistance here, it was nothing short of racism. He just doesn't think that the Ninevites are worthy of God's grace. He thinks that they fall outside of the bounds of God's grace. This was Jonah's self-righteousness. His pride blocked the grace of God in his life. And here's what it leads to. Look at verse 4. It says, "But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners, the sailors, they were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah, he had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and he had laid down, and he was fast asleep. So the captain came, and he said to him, 'What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise and call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give us our thought to us, that we may not perish.'" I want you to notice this progression here in Jonah's life. You see that Jonah's disobedience, it morphs into comfortable indifference. He's literally asleep in the middle of this raging storm. The sailors are afraid. These are professional sailors. Like, this would have been a terrible storm, and here's Jonah. He's dead asleep. Jonah's indifference, or his disobedience, has now led to comfortable indifference. The truth is, for us, in our life, when we resist the commands of God, what that ends up leading to in our life, it will lead you down a pathway of comfortable indifference. When you came in this morning, there was a card on your seat. It looked a lot like this, all right? If you're like, I didn't get one, it's probably under your butt, all right? So pull it out. What I want us to do is, I want us to use this card this morning. During response time, you'll have an opportunity just with you and the Lord just to think through. What are the resistances in our life? I don't know what God's called you to do. Maybe there's a particular sin in your life that God has clearly been telling you to turn from. Maybe there is a person in your life that God is calling you to reconcile with. Maybe there is something that God has laid on your heart, some type of mission that He's given you in your neighborhood or in this city. Maybe God has called you to go and to spread the gospel to the nations. I don't know what God has called you to, but I do know that every single one of us have some sort of resistance or resistances in our life. So what I want us to do this morning is I just want us to deal with those resistances. To meet those head on, to recognize that if we don't deal with those resistances in our life, that eventually what it will lead to is it will lead to comfortable indifference. That we will fall asleep in the midst of our sin. And we'll eventually just not care. And so I want you to hold on to those cards. We're going to revisit those in a second. And here's the truth that we see here as we get to the end of chapter 1. It's kind of a reassuring and also a scary truth. Because the truth is that Jonah flees from the presence of God, but what the Bible tells us is there's nowhere that you can go where you can get away from the presence of God. Psalm 139 says it this way. It says, "Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me." And so what we see here is that Jonah tries to get away from the presence of God, but God, He's going to come after Jonah. So the last and final thing that I want us to see is that God pursues. God pursues. In this story, everything that happens is from the Lord. It is showing us that God is in control of everything. From the storm to the lots, the stones that they cast, to the fish that swallows up Jonah. God is in control of all of it. And what you see in verses 4 through 5 shows us that because He loves us, because He cares for Jonah, because He cares for the Ninevites, God will not allow you to walk in continual rebellion. This is what the writer of Hebrews says. In Hebrews 12:6, he says, "For the Lord disciplines the one that He loves, and He chastises every son whom He receives." And so God pursues us in our resistance to Him. You know, here, this is not, the Bible doesn't say in Jonah that God allowed the storm. No, it says that God hurled it. God caused this storm in Jonah's life to turn him away from his rebellion and to bring him back into alignment with the commands of God because He loved him. And so the question we just have to ask ourselves, that we have to evaluate in our own life is what if sometimes in our life the things that appear like punishment from God, Like, what if the storms in our life, what if that's actually God sending something in our life to turn us back to himself? What if that's actually his kindness? You think about a child who doesn't understand the danger of a busy street. And here the child is playing near the road and the parent is watching them, and the child who doesn't really understand what it means to run into the middle of the road and all the ramifications of that. What if the parent then watches the child begin to run out into the road? The parent, of course, would panic and with all of their might, they would run to the child and they would grab a hold of that child, not necessarily concerned about if they're hurting the child or holding onto the child too tightly. They would grab the child with all passion and pull them away from the road. And the child would be confused. Most definitely, it would probably hurt the child. The child would look at their parent and they would see the look on their face, and they would probably start to cry because they're not understanding why it is that mom or dad would hurt me in this way. But what the parent knows that the child doesn't is that the pain of pulling you away from the road pales in comparison to the pain of getting hit by a car. And so in our life, God at times will send storms to turn us away from the rebellion that we find ourselves in. And here's what he does in Jonah's life. Look at verse 11. It says, "Then they said to him, the sailors, 'What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us?' For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. And he said to him, 'Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know that it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you.' Nevertheless, the men rowed harder to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, 'O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay on us not innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you.'" You see another response here. There's another response to God's command. So we've already seen that Jonah's response is that he rebelled. So some of us, we hear the commands of God and we run in the completely opposite direction. But do you see the other response here? What did the sailors do? The sailors, in their own efforts, they tried to row out of it. That's what religion is. What religion is, it says that I see the commands of God, and instead of relying on God, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try harder and do better. I'm going to, in my own effort, try to row myself out of this storm. Many of you in here maybe have experienced that time in your life where you've been rowing and rowing and rowing and trying harder to be a better person, to do more for God, only to realize that you have gone nowhere and yet you are very exhausted. And that's the picture that we see here. Here the sailors are trying to row out of the storm. Jonah says, let me tell you the solution. But what they do is they try in their own effort to get themselves out. Jonah says, that's not the solution. The only solution that works is surrender. Jonah surrendering to the sea. And this is why Jonah is such a beautiful picture of the gospel. Because the gospel is about surrender. I don't know if you notice it there. The sailors they say to God, they cry out to God and they say, "God, do not lay on us innocent blood." Listen, there was only one time in human history, in the course of human history, there was only one person whose blood was truly innocent, and it was not Jonah's. See, it was Jesus's who was truly innocent. Jesus was the one who lived the life that you and I were supposed to live. He lived a life perfectly. Jesus was the only one of whom it could be said that he was innocent. And yet, even though Jesus was innocent, Jesus was the one that was hurled into the sea. Jesus was thrown into the sea of God's wrath. Listen, the storm of God's wrath was barreling down upon us because of our sin. And the only way to pacify God's wrath against us was for Jesus to surrender himself to the cross. And so just as Jonah is thrown overboard and surrenders himself to the sea, so Jesus, the only truly innocent person that ever lived, surrenders himself to death on our behalf, to taking the penalty. And so the only way to save the sailors, it was the sacrifice of Jonah. The only way that you and I can be saved, the only way that we can be made right with God is through the sacrifice of Jesus. And so we see in the story of Jonah, we see ourselves. That like Jonah, we have rebelled against God. But God sent Jesus, just like he sent a storm into Jonah's life, God sends Jesus to bring us back into relationship with himself, to save us. And here's what happens. Look at the result. We'll finish with this, verse 16. says, then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. Listen to this, okay? And this is good news for us. Even in Jonah's rebellion, God's saving hand was at work. Even in the midst of Jonah's rebellion. The result was that the sailors who were worshiping false gods, now they fear God and they sacrifice to Him. What that means is in your life, God wastes nothing. That you might have lived in rebellion to God and God has drawn you back to you. Listen, God wastes nothing in your life. That He will use all things to bring people into a saving knowledge of Himself. And so God pursues Jonah. Jonah surrenders eventually, and God uses Jonah in his surrender. And it wasn't until Jonah was fully surrendered to the Lord that God began to use him to fulfill His work, to draw others to Himself. And so when you surrender, listen, when you surrender to things that, when the people in your life look at, you surrender to things that just don't make sense. The only way that you can make sense of it in your life is because you have what the Bible calls the peace that passes all understanding. When you surrender to those things in your life, what people see in you is not a life where you have everything together and everything is comfortable and everything is working out okay. What you have in your life is that in the midst of anything, that you can walk through the valley of the shadow of death and fear no evil. And what that means is that the people in your life, when your coworker, when all hell breaks loose in their life, or when your neighbor, when their life is falling apart, guess who they're going to come to? It's not the person whose life is put together, but rather it is the person who has surrendered their life to Christ and who has an unshakable trust in God no matter what they're going through. That's what the gospel does in us. Not only does it save us, but it sends us out.